Welcome everyone to the Australian Conference of Economists Day 3 and our keynote address by Professor Francine Blau. My name is Leonora Rees and it's my pleasure to be representing the Women in Economics Network. As we gather together today from various locations, let us acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands. I'm joining you today from Bungalung country, which is in southeast Queensland, and I acknowledge the Yugambeh people as the traditional custodians of these lands. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in attendance today. For those of you who don't know, the Women in Economics Network, or WEN for short, is a part of the Economic Society of Australia. WEN was created in 2017 to work towards fostering a more representative, diverse and gender-balanced economics profession in Australia, which makes the topic of today's keynote on the issue of the gender wage gap and gender gaps in the workforce all the more meaningful for us. It's my delight and honour to be welcoming Professor Francine Blau to our conference. Although we would love to be welcoming you here in person, given the circumstances, we are extremely grateful that you're able to join us late in the evening, your time there in the US. Professor Blau is the Francis Perkins Professor of Industrial and Labour Relations and a Professor of Economics at Cornell University. Among her many inspiring accolades and affiliations, she is a Research Associate of NBER and a Research Fellow of the IZA. Among her services to the profession, Professor Blau has served as the President of the Society of Labour Economists, as Vice President of the American Economic Association, and as Chair of the AEA's Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession, or CSWEP, which is like the US equivalent of WEN, or we like to think of CSWEP as WEN's bigger sister. Professor Blau has been honoured as a Distinguished Fellow of the AEA. She is a recipient of the Jacob Mincer Award by the Society of Labour Economists in recognition of a lifetime of contributions to the field of labour economics. And she was the first woman to receive the IZA Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Labour Economics. For furthering the status of women in the economics profession, she was the recipient of CSWEP's Carolyn Shaw Bell Award. Her book, The Economics of Women, Men and Work, co-authored with Anne Winkler, is currently in its 8th edition. It sits on my bookshelf. It was actually the first book that my PhD supervisor gave me when I started my thesis on women's workforce participation many years ago, which goes to show how enduring and seminal that publication has proven to be. Professor Blau has contributed a wealth of research on issues of gender, wage inequality, immigration, industrial relations, and other dimensions of the labour market. Her presentation today is What Do We Know About the Gender Wage Gap? And we're sure to learn some fascinating insights that apply to the Australian context as well. While most of Professor Blau's research focuses on the US workforce, the data attests that the gender pay gap well and truly prevails in Australia, currently at around 14%, according to ABS data comparing men and women's full-time earnings across all industries. And in her work, Professor Blau has done an incredible job of synthesizing the array of issues that economists need to navigate in terms of measuring gender pay gaps, detecting the causes, and identifying effective policies to address it. And as you'll hear from the keynote today, and as some of you are doing in your own research, economists are now moving beyond traditional models and explanations and uncovering more about the powerful role of psychological factors, structural barriers, societal norms and attitudes, and unconscious biases in terms of explaining why the gender pay gap has been so tough to crack. And Professor Blau will touch on these issues. The gender pay gap is just one metric of gender inequality and sits within this bigger spectrum of inequality of opportunity and inequities in power within society. Just before handing over to you, Fran, I would like to quickly say, I remember hearing you speak a few years ago at your IZA address in Berlin in 2018. And you highlighted how gender inequalities and impediments to women in the workforce can also take a hidden and less visible form. And this includes the omnipresent risk of sexual harassment. It's an unseen force that can compel women to turn down a job or to opt out of professional networking events because they are forced to trade off career opportunities against their own safety and dignity in a way that men generally don't have to do. It means foregone opportunities for women and foregone potential for the whole of the workforce. And I remember you saying then that economists need to do more to really acknowledge and understand these economic losses associated with sexual harassment. Since then, we've had the Me Too movement sweep the world. We've had the Human Rights Commission in Australia release its finding that 2 out of 5 women in Australia have experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. And in recent months in Australia, we've witnessed a wave of revelations of alleged assaults against women in Australian Parliament, including cases where women have had to give up their careers. So when you shared your keynote 3 years ago, it was a highly perceptive, forward-looking insight that is testament to your capacity to bring your knowledge together to see that bigger picture and foresee what are the most pressing issues ahead of us that we need to focus on. Your work is illustrating how to keep pushing the frontiers of economics research and to keep our finger on the pulse in terms of the issues that matter in the real world. We greatly look forward to hearing more of those insights and vision today. To the audience, we'd love to hear your questions for Professor Blau. Please send these in using the Q&A function in Zoom, and I'll share these at the end of the presentation. And you can tap on the thumbs up sign to endorse an existing question that you would like asked. It's now my pleasure to welcome Professor Francine Blau. Thank you, Fran.
Leonora, I feel almost speechless after that introduction. That was absolutely lovely, very, very flattering, and also very, very informative. So thank you so much for that. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, wherever here actually is. It's a little hard to know today. I was just talking to the group before we started formally and imagining what our life would have been like had the pandemic hit even 5 years ago without this excellent technology that we have. So again, I'm delighted to be here. Leonora reminded me of a brief anecdote, and that is, as she said, I'm a former chair of CSWEP, the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession, but she may not know I actually had a hand in founding CSWEP back in the 1970s. I went to an AEA meeting as a graduate student, kind of intent on kicking up a bit of a fuss. And we organized a group of women, graduate students, and faculty to petition the AEA for a committee on women. And we had an ace in the hole, and that was the president of the AEA at that time was John Kenneth Galbraith, who was very sympathetic to what we were doing. So that's a sort of a brief summary of how CSWEP was founded. So let me go on to my talk. So let me start with an overview. Part of my talk is going to provide new empirical evidence on the extent, trends, and sources of the gender wage gap in the United States over a considerable period of time, a 30-year period from 1980 to 2010. And as Leonora said, this is about the United States, but the gender wage gap that I'm looking at and many of the insights of our empirical analysis are applicable to most advanced industrialized countries, although some of the details, of course, may differ. And then I'm going to use this analysis as a springboard to review literature on explanations for the gap. Now, some of these explanations build on measured factors that I will have discussed in the empirical part of the paper. Others are not included because we don't have data sets, and in some cases we don't even have appropriate measurement of them. And they're potentially impacting what we call the unexplained gap that arises in the statistical analysis. But a caveat is that even factors that are not explicitly measured may be picked up by measured factors. And I want to point that out because I'll be talking about a number of things that aren't measured or measurable. And you may say, oh my gosh, they could explain the unexplained gap 150 times over. And that's just not true because A, they may not account for very much in any case, but also because some of them are picked up by measured factors. A simple example is we don't have a measure of what people majored in when they were in school, which could affect the gender pay gap. But on the other hand, we do control for their occupation, which is probably picking up a good bit of the impact of their major. I'm going to divide this into two broad sets of explanations. One are traditional explanations that many of you will have heard discussed, and these were kind of the arsenal that I had available to me when I first started studying this question: human capital theory, the notion of discrimination, underlying really in some respects both the gender division of labor in the home. But we also have new approaches, which I'll be going into: temporal flexibility, what we call non-cognitive skills or psychological attributes. Some people call it soft skills. All of this is in contradistinction to cognitive skills like math and verbal ability, reading and writing ability. And then gender norms that have turned out to be perhaps more stubborn than some of us might have expected. And then in remaining time, I'll say a few words about policies. Now, I do want to give credit where credit is due. Much of what I'm talking about today draws on joint work with my Cornell colleague and also my husband, Lawrence Kahn. And I'm especially drawing on our recent Journal of Economic Literature paper. I'm also integrating recent work on self-selection into the labor force with Larry and also two Cornell graduate students, Nikolai Babashko and Matthew Comey. And I want to say the two were excellent collaborators and full collaborators in this work. They're both excellent students. And Nikolai is on the job market this year, so I'd like to put in a good word for him, especially. I'm using, some of you who are data mavens, I'll mention that I'm using something called, on the US, the panel study of income dynamics for my empirical work. And it's important that this data set includes information on actual labor market experience, because that was one of the big insights of human capital theory, is that wages appreciate during periods of time in the labor force, but in the opposite hand, they depreciate during time out. So we do have to know what the actual labor force experience of the individuals are. And that's not available in most data sets. I'm focusing on workers primarily with considerable labor force attachment, working full-time and most of the year. So let me just go to some what I think are interesting results here. So this chart shows female to male log wage ratios. Very often I'm going to hop back and forth between the differential and the ratio. I've always found the ratio kind of a bit more meaningful intuitively to people. So I'll focus on that much of the time. And I'm going to look at what the gender ratio is unadjusted, that is when we simply run the data, and what it is if we adjust for various covariants, particularly human capital. And by that, I mean essentially education and experience, and what we call the full specification, which also includes the impact, in addition, of occupation, industry, and unionism. So what is this chart telling us? Well, first of all, the blue bars are the unadjusted gap, and we see right off the bat that there's been a lot of progress. And that is true in the United States, but it's also true in most other advanced industrialized countries. And certainly, though there's a persistent problem in Australia, it is also true that the gender pay gap has narrowed in Australia. So back in 1980, women earned 62% of what men earned in this data, but it's similar to other data sources. And by 2010, it was almost 80%. So 80% is a lot less than 100. It's a bigger gender pay gap than you have in Australia, 21%, but it does indicate considerable progress. Now, I'd like to start with 1980 because this is the way things looked kind of when I was starting out, and things were in some sense kind of well behaved. So you have here that women earn 62% of what men earn. If you control for education, and men had a slight advantage in college and beyond, and you controlled for experience, and men had a considerable experience advantage, we got up to 71%, a big increase indicating how important those factors were. A further increase when you controlled for occupation, industry, and unionism, a reflection of the impact of employment segregation. Fast forward 30 years, and you first of all see this enormous improvement, and you see that even controlling for various factors, despite the improvement, women do earn less than men. But the striking finding is right here, and that is when you control for human capital, you don't budge the ratio very much. So the bread and butter explanation for many years of the gender pay gap, at least in the US context, is not doing very much. What this reflects is two factors. First of all, women have not only caught up to men, but they've actually surpassed men in educational attainment. Among young men and women, there's a very noticeable gap. 57% of college degrees go to women. But as these younger cohorts have come in, the labor force as a whole is also flipped, and that women have a slight advantage in educational attainment. This is true not just in the United States, actually, but in virtually all advanced industrialized countries. And then, in addition, the experience gap between men and women has really shrunk. So human capital does not seem to be as important as it was. However, industry and occupation, not unionism, I'll come back to that, but industry and occupation continue to be quite important. And indeed, taken together, they would explain half the gender pay gap. Now, one other thing you can see in this chart is that all of these figures, as I mentioned before, fall short of 100%, and that means that there is an unexplained gap that cannot be accounted for by measured characteristics, at least not these measured characteristics. And one issue that arises is how we interpret that gap. Oh, before I say that, let me also note that that unexplained gap, although it still exists, is smaller than it used to be. So a decrease in the unexplained gap has played a role in the convergence of the gender wage gap. So how do we interpret the unexplained gap? Well, a very logical way to interpret it is as a measure of discrimination. It is, after all, what the difference in pay is between men and women with the same measured characteristics. However, I have to emphasize measured characteristics. So our data sets don't include everything that's of importance to employers. And this means that the unexplained gap is a biased indicator of discrimination. It could measure discrimination, but it could also measure gender differences and the impact of gender differences in unmeasured factors. So how are more skilled women faring? This is something that's come up in a number of countries, not just the United States. And the findings here seem to be pretty similar across a number of countries. The gender wage gap has been closing more slowly at the top than it has at other points in the wage or skill distribution. This is true both in raw figures, but also controlling for covariates. And it raises questions about a glass ceiling, a possible glass ceiling that is barriers to women's upward progression, but also questions about what other factors might contribute, especially to a larger gap for women at the top of the wage and skill distribution than at the middle or the bottom. Now, I just want to mention briefly what our research indicates about what accounts for the decrease in the overall gender wage gap. And we're using here a decomposition based on some earlier work by Juhn Murphy and Pierce. And basically, I identify the impact of gender changes in gender differences in means. So we know that women have traditionally had less labor market experience than men, but that this gap has narrowed. Precisely what role has that narrowing of the gender gap in experience played in narrowing the overall gender gap? The impact of coefficients is interesting, and I think it's not quite what some of you may think it means who've looked at some of the discrimination literature. This really highlights the fact that due to differences in means and differences in location in the economy, even if men and women receive the same returns to their characteristics, changes in the returns will impact them, men and women, differently. So let me be more specific with an example. There's a lot of segregation by occupation of men and women. Men and women tend to be in different jobs, even though that difference is narrowed. Male jobs, quote, male jobs, tend to pay more than female jobs. There's a premium to working in a predominantly male occupation. Well, what if that premium increases? What that means is that women, in a sense, have to run faster. I think there's something in Alice in Wonderland about this. Women have to run faster just to stay in the same place. So changes in coefficients, even if they impact or they are applied to men and women in the same way, if men and women receive the same return, they can disadvantage one gender group or another depending on gender differences in means. And I'll get back to this in terms of what we actually find. And then finally, there's the unexplained gap. And I suggested that has been shrinking. So what role did that play in narrowing the gender gap in the US? So let me look at sources. In terms of changing means, women catching up to and surpassing men in education explains about 14% of the closing. Women narrowing the experience difference with men explains 18%. Changes in unionization explain 12%. Let me briefly say this may be a US specific finding, and that is unionization has declined precipitously in the United States. Men traditionally, which were much more likely to be unionized than women and getting a union wage premium, but their unionization declined much faster than women's did. And so it's the really male loss of union jobs that has had a positive effect on the narrowing the gender pay gap, because the gender difference in unionization has narrowed. In terms of industry, not much has happened. Occupation, big story in the United States and perhaps elsewhere, that women have been entering traditionally male occupations like law, professions like law and medicine and management, and that's helped to narrow the gender pay gap. On the other hand, the rewards for being in occupations where men are more heavily represented have gone up, and that's increased the gender pay gap. And a big source of convergence is actually the decline in the quote unexplained gap. It has a similar role to the effect of changing means. So that raises the question of what does that decrease in the unexplained gap mean? I have to say again, it could be a decrease in discrimination. I personally believe it is, and I believe there's some evidence consistent with that. But it also likely does represent improvement in women's unmeasured characteristics, just as their measured characteristics have improved, like education and experience. Unmeasured characteristics like motivation, commitment, negotiating skills may have also improved. Let me skip over to also something I think is important and could use more research. There was considerable amount of research earlier in the 2000s, but we haven't been looking at as much recently. And that is that there have been some demand shifts that have benefited women workers relative to men workers. Essentially, women were better located in the economy for the way in which the economy was evolving. Specifically, men were much more likely to be blue-collar workers in manufacturing who were losing jobs. Women were well positioned in white-collar and service jobs and service industries. In terms of changes in selection, I'm just going to talk about that now, but I want to make the point that our research, I mentioned before with Larry Kahn, Nikolai Babashko, and Matt Comey, suggests that changes in the composition of male and female workers in terms of unmeasured characteristics does not account for the decrease in the overall gender pay gap or the unexplained gap. So this is a true decline, and it's not an artifact of selection. So what about selection? What is it? So of course, this builds on seminal work by James Heckman. And the basic idea is that individuals self-select into the labor force. And in general, we only observe wages for individuals who are employed. But this can produce a bias if there's a systematic direction to labor force participation that we don't take account of. So, for example, if the people out of the labor force, let's say if the women out of the labor force are those who got low wage offers, given their unmeasured characteristics. Got low wage offers controlling for their measured characteristics. We might form too rosy or positive view of the gender pay gap because we're not counting low wage women who are out. On the other hand, it may be that women are out of the labor force because they have very high value of their non-market time, perhaps because their time is valued very highly in the household. This might be the case if, due to assortative mating, women are married, high-skilled women are married to high-skilled men. So the direction of the bias is unclear at a point in time, and then it's made more complicated by the fact that female participation rates have been increasing. So one possible scenario, and it's not the scenario we find, but one possible scenario could be that it's the high-skilled women disproportionately who are drawn into the labor force, and what looks like a decline in the gender wage gap, or what looks like convergence, is actually due to a shift in the unmeasured characteristics of women in the labor force. Another case in which selection could produce what we're mistakenly calling convergence in the gender pay gap would be, especially in the United States, male participation rates have been decreasing. It's low-skilled men who are increasingly dropping out. Again, we may form too rosy a picture about the progress women are making. So we feel previous work has not answered this question. It's produced mixed results. Some of the adjustment mechanisms use non-representative subsamples of the population or wage imputation methods that are highly sensitive to underlying assumptions. Let me also mention here that when I first got into this business, we worried a lot about changes in female participation rates, but actually, again, male rates have been changing, and we would want to correct for selection of both. We do a very comprehensive analysis in our paper that I recommend to you, and we check out virtually all the major approaches to adjust for selection. Our results are very robust, and they strongly suggest the gender wage gap convergence is not an artifact of selection. Indeed, in our preferred approach, it's closing a bit faster after adjusting for selection than before. What is our preferred approach? I haven't got time to go into detail, but basically, following some earlier work by Derek Neal, we use our longitudinal data with longitudinal data to obtain actual wage data for adjacent years for people without current wages. And what this does is it reduces our problem of needing to impute wages, but we still do need to impute some wages, and there we use a kind of common sense approach, which does reflect uncertainty in the fact that we don't know the wages of individuals who are out of the labor force, but basically we impute their wages based on a set of predicted probabilities of their wages falling into wage deciles. But again, our results are very robust to the specific technique we use, but here they are for our preferred approach, and we have the unexplained gap, uncorrected for selection is the blue line. and the unexplained gap corrected for both men, where both men and women are corrected for selection. Both tend to be important, although since there are many more women out of the labor force, the correction for selection is more important for women than men. And you see the two lines are quite similar. They happen to end in the same place. Interestingly, not because there was no selection in 2015, but because selection of men and women into the labor force, the impact of selection of men and women into the labor force actually counterbalanced each other. But in any case, you see that we start higher here in 1981, we end at the same point. So if anything, progress or convergence is a bit faster. So let me, in the time I have left, move on to explanations. I'm not doing full justice here in this talk for the many important insights that we have to the gender pay gap, but let me take a stab at it. First of all, again, the human capital explanation, the bread and butter for many years of analyzing the gender pay gap. We already saw that in the aggregate, education and experience taken together don't explain much of the gap anymore in the US, though there is still a small experience gap that favors math. So there's nothing conceptually wrong with the human capital model, it's just declined in explanatory power in the United States. But I do want to point out that experience and hours do remain particularly important in some high-skilled jobs. And remember, the gap fell less for those jobs than those middle and lower skilled. But does that reflect the impact of gender differences in human capital? Important relatively new work by Claudia Golden suggests that the importance of hours and experience, at least in some high-skilled jobs, may not be due to the impact of human capital. If there's a large penalty, for example, in business or law to interrupted careers, it may not be because skills depreciate during time out of the labor force. It may, or if there's a large negative effect of working fewer hours, it may not be because your skills are less good if you have shorter hours. It may rather reflect the fact that in some jobs, long hours are virtually required. This is the case, again, particularly in law and business in the United States. And it's also required that work be performed at particular times and in particular places. And there is a compensating differential for providing this, so that working long hours doesn't just increase your income, wages times hours, it actually boosts your wage rate. Now, given the gender division of labor in most families, women are less likely to be able to provide this long hours of work, and this means they don't get the premium or they pay a penalty, and that contributes to the gender wage gap. Again, it's not something across the board. It's especially in high-skilled occupations and even within there in law and business. Golden emphasizes that this causes a pay gap within occupations, but there is also some evidence that it might contribute to occupational segregation where women shy away from occupations where they're going to have to put in these long hours. Now, the traditional division of labor in the home is another factor. The motherhood wage penalty has gotten a lot of attention. I'm going to focus on that right now, but I also want to point out that let me say, women face a penalty for being mothers or having children. Men do not for being fathers. Men receive a premium for being married, women do not. And of course, these gender differences contribute to the pay gap. There are also joint location issues when we have two careers. And these, given traditional gender roles, tend to disproportionately adversely affect women who may be tide movers following their husband's job, or tide stayers unable to move to better opportunities because of their husband's employment. One interesting question is why there's a motherhood wage penalty. And remember, wages are hourly rates of pay. So we know from some literature that, of course, not surprisingly, having children adversely impacts women's labor force participation rates. It adversely impacts the hours they work. But a wage penalty is controlling for hours, and also in some research, controlling for experience. Why then would moms earn less? And there are a bunch of possible explanations. They may be because of additional burdens in the home compared to men. They may put in less effort on the job. They may feel that they have to turn down promotions. They may move to lower paying occupations or firms that are more family friendly. So all of these things could contribute to a motherhood wage penalty. I feel it's very important to note that the aggregate gender wage gap reinforces the traditional division of labor. So we are thinking of this as supply side factors, but it is also true that, sorry, I just looked at the time. I'm getting a bit worried about that. Okay, so it is also true that if a married couple or a couple that's living together faces a situation where the female is the lower earner, then it'll make sense to prioritize the male career. And indeed, there's actually also evidence that discrimination plays a role in the motherhood penalty. Some fascinating research held constant qualifications, and they found that mothers, both in the lab and the field, received lower offers or callbacks than non-mothers, but there was no difference for fathers compared to non-fathers. I don't have time to go into great detail, but let me say that the existence of an unexplained gap in statistical analyses is suggestive of discrimination. We have experimental evidence that tends to reinforce that. And there are a number of interesting studies showing discrimination in experimental contexts a number of years ago now in symphony orchestras and waiters and waitress jobs, but also quite a bit more recently is science lab managers and in the lab too of an experimental setting performing math tasks. I do want to emphasize, as Leonora mentioned, this does not mean that discrimination is overt and conscious. Implicit discrimination, that's a term that Bertrand, Chu, and Mullinatham coined for unconscious discrimination, drawing on literature in social psychology. And indeed, social psychologists actually have a website which you might want to look at and test yourself and see the extent to which you harbor implicit stereotypes yourself. I think this is, to me, the next frontier in the discrimination area. The newer factors include these non-cognitive skills. Women are less likely to negotiate. They tend, relative to men, to shy away from competition on average. The evidence is less good, but they seem to be more risk averse. We can think of scenarios of how this could lower their relative pay, but it is actually true that not all non-cognitive skills favor men, and indeed women are found to have a higher average, on average, a higher level of interpersonal skills, which would work in their favor in terms of pay gaps. Now, I think a number of us find this work fascinating. We're also a bit cautious about it. There are some caveats. Factors favoring men may not be optimal in all circumstances. The classic paper by Niederle and Westerlin found that in terms of maximizing pay, women did compete too little, but men actually competed too much. The desire to compete is not always optimal. In one paper, they found that speculative bubbles were less likely to arise among groups of women than groups of men, suggesting that men in some circumstances may not be as risk averse as they should be. Women also encounter negative reactions when they act in unfeminine ways. So you can't just take your analysis and say, well, if women would negotiate more, they would narrow the gap. First of all, they might get a negative reaction to acting in that way. But secondly, negotiation is a form of bargaining, and that is going to depend on what your opportunities are. So in a labor market that overall discriminates against women, women are not going to benefit or not going to be able to eliminate the gap through negotiation. A lot of the studies are done in a way that it's hard to find their quantitative importance, but I'd refer you to our paper where we accumulate results from studies that did have quantitative measures, and our overall finding suggested a modest effect of these factors. And they do play a role, but they're not going to be a silver bullet in defining, in analyzing the gender pay gap. Even less time now to go into it, but gender identity or norms can be important. Let me just call your attention to one study by Bertrand et al. That found within couples, if a wife was predicted to earn more than her husband, she was less likely to participate in the labor force, or if she does, her income is lower than predicted. So they found that was mainly due to working fewer hours, but it does raise the possibility of women actually holding back in various ways so as not to exceed their husband's wages. And indeed, in a study I don't have time to go into in detail, Burston, Fujiwara, and Pallas found that among MBAs at a top business school, women gave less career-minded responses when they expected a survey they were filling out to be shared with their MBA classmates. So it looked like they were trying to make themselves appear less ambitious and more attractive in the marriage market. Married women and men who were married or single did not vary their responses in this way. So some brief comments on policy. Perhaps we can come back to this in the questions. Family-friendly policies like parental leave and part-time mandates are very helpful and desirable, but one has to guard against their, for want of a better term, mommy tracking women, encouraging women to stay out or break the tie, to break their labor force attachment to a greater extent than they would have otherwise. Maybe even encouraging discrimination against women if employers fear that women will be out for a long time. So there's a bit of a trade-off between parental leave and part-time mandates that encourage employment, but may have a negative effect on gender equity within the labor market. This is not true of early education programs and childcare, which have an unambiguously positive effect. Discrimination, anti-discrimination policy continues being important. And I would like to point out in work that Larry and I have done, looking across countries actually, is that wage setting institutions, even if they're applied equally in the same way to men and women, can impact the gender wage gap. And the reason is because women are disproportionately located at the bottom of the distribution. So any policies that bring up the bottom will disproportionately benefit women and reduce the gender pay gap. And this is true not just of kind of minimum wage type legislation, but also unions reducing differences across firms in wages, since women tend to be concentrated in low wage firms. So in conclusion, women have made significant and dramatic progress, not just in the United States, but internationally. But important inequalities remain, and there is no one single unified explanation, just a variety of factors that I've gone through today that contribute to the gap. Some long-standing traditional factors are still important, but newer explanations are quite interesting and give a lot of food for thought. As Leonora mentioned, I did say this a number of years ago, but I don't think the situation has changed that much. We do need more work on sexual harassment by economists. And the little that we know about this suggests that sexual harassment, at least in the United States, doesn't generally, most women who are harassed do not file complaints for various reasons, but they do tend to shift their jobs. They do tend to be adversely affected in terms of their ability to see clients and coworkers. It's an invisible tax on women that needs a lot more examination than we've given it. One point I haven't emphasized in this talk is that to some extent, women's gains are accompanied, not causally, but have been accompanied by losses for men. Less skilled men in the United States are faring particularly poorly in terms of participation, wage inequality, gaps, real wage trends, loss of union jobs. There have been similar trends among women, but in general, low-skilled women are faring a bit better than low-skilled men. But the fates of the two groups among heterosexuals is intertwined by the family. And as men's opportunities, as less skilled men's opportunities have been declining, we've seen a growth of female headship. And this is a group that faces a lot of economic problems. So that's it. I'm really looking forward to the questions. I apologize for going over a bit, and let's hear from Leonora.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fran, for such a comprehensive and inspiring presentation. It really puts it, when we take stock of what do we know and we put it all together, it's really valuable for all of us to sit in and listen to that. Thank you so much. We have we have some fantastic questions coming through, and I'm going to do my best to bundle together some of them because we won't have time to get through all of them. I'd like to ask you, based on your experience and your knowledge that you've accumulated as an economist, as a researcher, we want that knowledge to have impact, right? To be translated into policy. What would you say are the biggest challenges for us as economists, as researchers, to translate that information in an effective and meaningful way for policymakers? And that question is meant to sort of capture some of those questions that are coming through about, what would you like to see happen in the policy space? And also potentially clarifying some misunderstandings or misconceptions or myths surrounding the gender pay gap as well. So that's a big question. Over to you to reflect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. I think I'm going to be reflecting on it. See, I'm slightly going out of focus. I have the best camera, but so maybe that says something about my answer. But I think there's a cartoon that I'm not this cynical, but there's a cartoon where policymakers looking at his underling, and he says, "Well, that's the policy. Now find me some evidence to support it." We face a situation where there are kind of ideological blinders to some of what we would propose as social scientists. And of course, we don't all agree with each other. But I'm heartened in the United States, at least currently, under the Biden administration, where they seem to have really taken to heart gender inequities, and I would say especially the role of childcare in that, because in the United States, even worse than a lot of other countries, I would have always supported the importance of childcare and subsidization for it, but it's been a kind of indivisible thing that women have dealt with as individuals.
Mm-hmm. So that would be one that you would highlight.
I would highlight that. And I would also highlight that sometimes economists have a little bad news. And I feel like I'm totally, and I want to be completely clear, totally supportive of parental leave. But sometimes there's an optimal amount of something, and more is not always better. And in fact, it's interesting to me that parental leave has been extended for very long periods in relatively conservative countries, because women are disproportionately taking that leave, and it is sort of pulling them out of the labor force. So sometimes even our allies may be upset with certain things that we point out. So it might say in the United States, we have 12 weeks of unpaid leave, and that's way too little.
Yeah, I think Australia is sort of down the same end of the spectrum as the US in terms of mandated leave entitlements. And it is a reminder to keep our eye on the bigger picture about overall economic well-being, which goes beyond simply leave entitlements. Perhaps that's a takeaway from that as well.
And the importance actually of something you can't mandate, and that is sharing. Sharing of housework, sharing of childcare between partners.
In Australia, there's a lot more conversation happening about promoting a culture and leave entitlements that support fathers to take a larger and fairer share of child rearing as well, because it has implications for women's workforce participation down the track. Do you have any examples of other countries of policies that have efficiently managed to curb or to address this wage gap? That's a question that's come in, and I think maybe while you're thinking of that, we do have an increasing focus on pay auditing and transparency and reporting that seems to be gaining sort of attention. Do you have any insights on that particular strategy?
Yes. So one thing I would point to, actually some miles of Scandinavian countries, I'm sure you're aware of, but let me point out two aspects. One is that I pointed to before of combating wage inequality and gender wage inequality are related, because when we seek to compress the wage distribution, especially by bringing up the bottom, we do disproportionately benefit women. And so this actually, in some research that Larry Kahn and I did, this was the main reason for the relatively small gender pay gap in the US. Or take Australia as an example, when you introduce pay equity that tended to compress differentials across occupations, that had a big narrowing effect. So you have to think whether or not you want to do this and how, but I do want to point out that it can be helpful and effective. The other thing that you're probably aware of is use it or lose it. Are you doing that at all? Yes, in this.
Oh, we're not doing it, but we know about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is helpful, very helpful. And that is, for those who may not know, that the family gets a certain amount of additional leave, but only if the dad takes it and not if the mom does. That seems to really incentivize men taking some leave, but could still be huge gaps in the amount of leave. Two new things on the horizon that I'm glad you reminded me of, I'd like to mention. One is transparency, and we're just beginning to get some analyses of it that suggest a positive effect. So that means, for example, in the UK, where they are publishing the gender wage gap by firm, and they are finding that that's having something of a compressing effect. The other thing that some localities in the US have adopted, I don't know if you've heard of this, is wage history bans. So a very common thing when you hire people is to say, all right, what are you making now? Or what did you make in your last job? But that can actually bring labor market discrimination into the discussion. So a woman will say she was earning this and a man was earning, that much more, and they'll come in with a gap for that reason. So wage history ban, something to think about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. There is so much more we could say, if only we had more time, but we're just gone over time. I'm so sorry I can't ask all of the questions that have come in, but hopefully we can find a way to follow up. It's my role now to say a huge thank you to you, Fran, for giving your time towards this conference, for being a role model and a leader for us in the economics community. Thank you for sharing your story about how CSWEP was created, which really inspires us. And we're so glad that we can connect to you from the other side of the globe and to share this knowledge for what is truly a global problem that economists have a role in addressing. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. This has just been a wonderful pleasure. And I'm so glad to have the opportunity to speak to this group. Thank you.
Many thanks. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.